Hi, everybody. So as Ella said, I'm Priyanka, and I'm going to talk about sustainable open source, which is also the title of this meetup. So clearly, I'm so creative. So I am seeing lately that currently, there's like an epidemic out there that everybody wants to have an open source community strategy. People everywhere, like they come to me and they're just like, hey, like we need to like mobilize the audience. We need to like get developers behind us. And it's just like, it's happening almost too much. So how have I seen this? Like, how do I know this is happening? Because often there's talk of like, is open source the right path, et cetera. Well, so towards the end of 2014, I co-founded WakaTime with my co-founder, Alan. And we, as Ella said, are open source plugins for time tracking. So we're completely automated. Over the course of 2015, we built up a really strong community of over 50,000 developers. And over 100 of them contributed to the code. And it's just been a really wonderful experience. What we found, though, when we talked to investors or the business types was like, oh, like open source plugins, what's the defensibility here? This is stressful. And we're like, OK. And so far, our product continues to grow. Towards the end of 2015, we added a consulting component because got to pay the bills, and started working with, I started working with more developer products and got more experience in different open source strategies. So my biggest client has been Postman, the REST API testing client, which has over 3 million developers. So there I saw how they were approaching open source. Parts of their product are also, the source code is available. And then, like, come to 2016, now we're at a stage where within months, the situation is such that every week I get like 1 to 3 requests for consulting, advice on how to create an open source community. So clearly, the words got on that you can have a really good strategy based on open source. So when you think about it, what is driving the sudden excitement? So it's the success of bottoms-up sales models with companies like Slack and GitLab, who you just heard from and I deeply respect, that there's the VCs and everybody is very excited that, oh, this is a sales channel that can be, you know, used to advantage, et cetera. And that's why you're seeing this euphoria around open source suddenly. Now, that's great. We want more and more contributions. We want more people giving back to the community. But like, why is this strategy working for at least some people? Which makes a lot of other people think that, of course, this will work for me too, because every startup is the same, right? So the roots of it go back to the deep connection between open source and enterprise. I want to give a caveat here. I'm going to give a bird's eye view of a little bit of the history of open source and the philosophy behind it and why it's such a powerful force in software development and ultimately in our world. I am not going to go over everything that happened, and some of the things that are important which I do not cover include going into the differences of like licensing, which it's not that it's not important, but like it's actually a very core concept to open source, but because that's like a talk in itself. So this is selective pieces of information. The goal is to give you a sense of just how core open source is to our developer community. One more thing, when I say open source, I'm using the term loosely. I'm not distinguishing much between free software movement and the open source initiative, all those details. So keep that in mind. Now, with that long disclaimer said, going back to the big connection between open source and enterprise. So in the very beginning, much before the internet, when like hardware was what was sold by companies like IBM, the source code was always released, and it was packaged as part of the hardware. And the reasoning was often that, then people can just like look through bugs on their own, self-troubleshoot. And the idea was, if something's happening on your machine, you need to know what it is. You need to see what's going on. And that has stayed a very critical piece of the software development community to date. It's been the most important principle. The second thing that Open Enterprise did was that it used open source. Once a lot of more software started popping up on its own, people started building it, the fact is that when you know the source code, it's a lot more customizable. and you also feel more secure about what's going on with the data. There are more eyes on the project. There's just a lot of benefits, and they started using a lot of these good open source technologies. And then the third thing that enterprise did for open source was it created a large value for any developer who developed expertise on a certain technology, contributed to it, and gained reputation. So it created a marketplace. Often when people think of open source contribution, it's like, oh, this is all like charity or philanthropy. And while there is always that altruistic motivation, but it's very clearly impact-driven too, because you do well in an open source project. That technology is used by enterprise. They value that skill set, and you're just more marketable. So it's kind of similar to these meetups here we have, like Impact.tech, right, where it's not all fuzzy woo-woo stuff. It's more like there is an impact to having good impact. So as I said, the connection between enterprise and open source was always strong. But there was a time that caused a little bit of confusion. I call it the obfuscation era, because I like the word obfuscation. But so Microsoft, when they became big, they were selling all software. So they denounced the hobbyists or the open source software creators a lot, just because their business model was like, proprietary software. And that kind of started creating like this business or open source kind of mentality. At the same time, though, the LAMP stack, which is Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, was enabling people who were startups or individuals who didn't have the resources to still get started and then grow big. And then in '98, open source software, like as an official term, was coined because Netscape released the source code for their navigator, and on Feb 3rd, the term was born. So this was the time where the confusion, which we now often hear people talk about, started. But the core philosophy around software development has remained that if you are using something, you install it on your computer, and data is traversing through something, you should know what's going on and how things are happening. When I talk to a lot of founders who are creating communities that are very strong, where people are contributing, people are using, you hear this. In fact, with WakaTime, we open sourced our plugins because the plugin is installed in your text editor. You should know what data we're taking to our server because, this is your coding activity. It's pretty precious. It's just the right thing to do. The benefit along with that is that because people know how a plugin's written, they'll write a plugin when they need one, and that just increases our ecosystem, and there's more and more coverage. But it first starts with the philosophy. The same I observed with Postman, where they have over 3 million developers, and there are parts of the project that are open source. Which ones are those? They have a command line companion, which obviously, if you're integrating with build systems, there needs to be transparency, and so that's open source. And then they have an interceptor proxy for looking through HTTP requests from the browser, and that's also open source because, again, same principle, lots of data going back and forth, you need to know. So this core philosophy has been the undercurrent in the developer community in general, and enterprise has also championed it. Of course, a company built on open source principles can have considerable advantages, primarily because of this strength. And the strength is that the open source connects to developers, that connects to enterprise. If someone gets started on a project that has some open source component in it, the strongest things that work, if developers are even part of your audience, there's philosophical alignment. There's an emotional connection with your user. You're putting them first, and that always helps. Your development costs might be lower because with successful open source projects, there's more eyes on the project, more people reporting bugs, more people contributing. It's just better. Keep in mind the successful part, though, because open source projects can go really wrong if run badly. It's better to be closed source than that. And this is my personal opinion. And then the third part, very important and what is gaining a lot of eyeballs right now, is that the path to enterprise customers gets created because of the preference to customizable and secure software. And this third part is the reason why so many people suddenly want that strategy. So many people suddenly are like, oh, this is going to lead me to the $sign. It will, but at the end of the day, a good strategy is a good product. People will use your product because it's useful, not because it's open source. So you can't supplant like having something that is really addressing a need with just open sourcing it. With a good open source strategy, along with knowing the paramount importance of your product, there needs to be philosophical alignment. The best founders I've seen genuinely believe in the core open source principles. To them, it is vital that that stays the case, that people know what software they're using, what the source code is, how they can customize it. The second thing is there needs to be a clear connection between your product positioning and value prop. So for example, if your product is primarily a design improvement, maybe like a really great dashboard, you could open source it, but like you'll get a lot of pull requests for like button color change, this, that. It's like the value is maybe not as high. So you have to think that through and make sure the parts you open source are actually valuable as open source. And the third, probably very important thing that most people in today's excitement are forgetting is that you need a realistic time frame. You can't start a project today and have like 1 million customers in a month. It's not that fast-paced. The best projects took some time to take off. It's not that Linux was born today and then tomorrow it's just 53% of the market share. That's not how it starts and goes through. So as you hear this stuff, you're like, oh, that's a no-brainer. I'm smart enough. I understand that. Why is she talking about it? But the reality is, what I'm hearing from some of the very best startups in the Valley is very unsustainable strategies. They're forgetting these very straightforward truths, very core principles. And you don't have to believe me. Since I talk to so many people with all these requests all the time, I thought the next best thing I can do to like actually having you in the conversations with me was to share some quotes that I've come across. Of course, everything is going to stay anonymous because, not a jerk. But the idea is to just give a picture of what's really going on right now. And these are 100% true. I've heard these in the past few months. It's kind of crazy. So if you'll bear with my play acting a little bit right now. So we have time to put into creating an open source community. There's full 2 months before we expect any results. Of course, because people will put their blood, sweat, and tears into your timeline. Oh, by the way, people, if you know the people whose pictures these are, super cool. My product is meant for CIOs, but we need a bottoms-up strategy. Who has time to focus when you're an early stage startup, right? That's stupid. Our VCs really recommend we push an open source community because VCs know everything. So I was talking to someone, and I was like, I see the use case of your product for teams, but I don't necessarily see how like an individual developer will really find this useful, get behind it, eventually contribute to it. And the response I got was, well, you see, it's all about customer acquisition cost and lifetime value. Because not answering the question is the best strategy of all. This one was really awesome. We really want people building on our platform. No, we do not have time to look through the code contributions and engage. Can you please do everything for us? I expect people to devote time to my project, but I'm too busy, I'm sorry. Now, they sound unreal, but this is what's happening right now. And if I could, I would spend like all my time like trying to sort of walk people through like some good strategies and like how to think about these things. But the reality is there's only 24 hours in a day, and there's only so many consulting projects you can do, et cetera. I've petitioned for 34 hours. I'll let you know when it's approved. Until then, I've decided to open source a small guide to good open source strategy frameworks, and hopefully this will help people. I recently decided this after like the last conversation which went crazy, so I'm going to release the book by April. So hopefully that will help people and control this excitement. It's really good that open source is getting so much attention. It's really great that people notice how valuable it is. It was thriving before, it's going to thrive now, it's going to thrive in the future. And more people should get involved, but the right way, in the impactful way, in the sustainable way. People will always use your product because it's useful, not because it's open source. So this strategy needs to be used wisely. It's very good chatting with you all.